I'm Maxine Richardson, 34, and I've spent most of my life being invisible in my own family. While my sister Claire basked in golden child glory, I was the forgotten middle daughter who supposedly had no direction. At Mom's funeral last month, Claire delivered her final cruel blow. Face it, Maxine, you'll die alone just like you've lived unwanted and unremarkable. Her words cut deep because I'd spent years believing them. What Claire didn't know was that the quiet man standing respectfully in the back wasn't just my friend David. He was David Chen, the billionaire tech mogul I'd married 6 months earlier in a private ceremony. We kept it secret while I sorted through the complicated emotions of loving someone who saw value in me when my own family never did dot as the service ended. David stepped forward and gently took my hand. The shock on Claire's face was worth every tear I'd shed in silence. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about finding the courage to be seen. Growing up in the Richardson household meant learning to make yourself small. While Claire commanded attention with her perfectly styled blonde hair and infectious laugh, I became a master of invisibility. The family photo from my 10th birthday tells the whole story, Mom, Dad, and Claire beaming at the camera while I'm partially cut off at the edge, forgotten by whoever was taking the picture. Maxine's just going through a phase, Mom would say whenever teachers mentioned my academic achievements. She'd find her way eventually. Meanwhile, Claire's mediocre report cards were celebrated like Nobel Prize announcements. Every B+ earned her a shopping trip, while my straight A's earned me distracted. That's nice. Honey from behind Dad's newspaper. Dad owned a small construction company, and Claire was already being groomed to take over the business side. She had no interest in construction, but she loved the idea of being the boss. During summer breaks, she'd strut around the office in her designer clothes, flirting with the workers and making grand plans for modernizing the company. I spent those same summers reading programming books and teaching myself HTML in my bedroom. When I built my first website at 13, I excitedly showed it to Dad. He glanced at the screen for maybe 3 seconds before saying, "That's nice, sweetheart, but computers are just a hobby. You need to think about real career options." Real career options apparently meant following in Claire's footsteps, being charming, being pretty, being everything I wasn't. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's real business was struggling, while my hobby was shaping the future of entire industries. The pattern continued through high school. Claire was homecoming queen, prom queen, and the center of every social gathering. I was the girl who finished her homework early and spent lunch periods in the computer lab. When I got accepted to MIT with a full scholarship, the family celebration lasted exactly as long as it took to read the letter aloud. "MIT, that's nice," Dad said, then immediately turned to Claire. "Speaking of college, we need to talk about increasing your allowance for senior year." Even my graduation from MIT felt like a footnote in the family narrative. They came to the ceremony, but spent the entire time discussing Claire's upcoming wedding plans. I remember standing in my cap and gown, holding my diploma, and feeling completely invisible despite being surrounded by family. The worst part wasn't the neglect. It was the way they made me feel guilty for wanting more. When I'd express hurt or frustration, Mom would sigh and say, "Maxine, you're being too sensitive. Claire just has different strengths than you do." Different strengths. That was the family code for Claire is everything we value, and you're not. By the time I graduated and moved away from my first job, I had internalized their message so deeply that I barely recognized my own achievements. I was successful, independent, and brilliant, but I felt like a fraud waiting to be discovered. The MIT diploma sits in my closet, still in its frame, gathering dust behind winter coats I rarely wear. Not because I'm not proud of it, but because there's no point in displaying achievements that no one in your family understands or values. By 34, I had built a career that would have made my professors proud. Senior software engineer at Quantum Dynamics, one of the most innovative tech companies in Silicon Valley. My algorithms were powering applications used by millions of people worldwide. My annual salary was more than Dad's construction company had ever grossed in its best year. But when I called home, Dad would still ask, "So When are you going to get a real job? As if solving complex computational problems was somehow less legitimate than laying concrete. The irony was delicious in its cruelty. While Claire bounced between part-time jobs and relied on increasingly generous loans from our parents, I was quietly building wealth that would have shocked them. My investment portfolio was diversified, my savings substantial, and my financial independence complete. Not that they ever asked about the details. To them, I was still the awkward teenager who spent too much time with computers. They couldn't fathom that their weird daughter was actually thriving in ways they couldn't measure. My colleagues at Quantum Dynamics knew a different version of Maxine Richardson. Here, I was respected for my analytical mind and innovative solutions. I led team meetings with confidence, presented to executives without flinching, and mentored junior developers who looked up to me with genuine admiration. Richardson's algorithms are revolutionary. I once overheard the CTO telling the board. She's the kind of talent that companies like Google would kill to poach. The professional validation felt amazing, but it also highlighted the painful disconnect between who I was in the world and who I was perceived to be at home. At work, I was indispensable. At family gatherings, I was the girl they seated at the kids' table well into my 20s. The last family dinner I attended before Mom got sick was particularly brutal. Claire had just started dating another unemployed musician, and Mom was gushing about his artistic soul. Meanwhile, I had just been promoted to lead architect on a project that would revolutionize how people interact with smart home technology. "What about you, Maxine?" Dad asked during dessert. "Still playing with computers?" "Playing with computers." As if I was still 13 and tinkering with basic HTML, I am leading a team of 15 engineers on a project that's going to change how people live in their homes. I said quietly. Claire laughed. "God, you make everything sound so dramatic." "It's just apps, right? Like, anyone can make those now." I didn't have the energy to explain that those apps required advanced machine learning, complex data analysis, and years of specialized knowledge. I just nodded and changed the subject. That night, I drove home to my beautiful apartment overlooking the bay filled with smart home technology I had helped create and felt emptier than ever. Success without recognition from the people who mattered most felt like shouting into a void. I had everything I thought I wanted: career achievement, financial security, professional respect, but I still felt like that 10-year-old girl cut off at the edge of the family photo. The coffee shop receipt is still tucked in my wallet, creased and faded March 5th, 10th, 2:47 p.m. 2 lattes and a blueberry muffin. Such an ordinary moment that changed everything. I was having lunch alone, as usual, scrolling through technical documentation on my laptop when someone knocked over his coffee at the table next to mine. The dark liquid spread across the floor, and without thinking, I grabbed napkins from my table and knelt down to help clean it up. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice warm and slightly embarrassed. "I'm perfectly capable of cleaning up my own disasters." When I looked up, I saw kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a genuinely grateful smile. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, nothing that screamed wealth or status. Just a regular guy who seemed flustered by his clumsiness. "It's no problem," I said, helping him soak up the last of the spill. "I've been there. These tables are ridiculously small." "David?" he said, extending his hand once we disposed of the soggy napkins. "Maxine." He insisted on buying me another coffee. As a thank you, even though I protested that napkins were free, we ended up talking for 2 hours about everything except workbooks, travel, the peculiar psychology of people who put pineapple on pizza. What struck me most was how he listened. Not the polite, waiting for my turn to speak kind of listening I was used to, but genuine engagement with what I was saying. When I mentioned loving obscure science fiction novels, he didn't change the subject or make jokes about nerdy interests. Instead, he asked for recommendations and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. "I have to admit," he said as we prepared to leave, "I came here planning to work, but this was much better than anything I had planned." I felt the same way. For the first time in years, I talked to someone who seemed to see me not as the disappointing daughter or the stereotypical computer geek, but as a person worth knowing. Same time next week? He asked, and I found myself nodding before I could overthink it. That became our routine. Every Thursday at 2:30, we'd meet at the same coffee shop. He'd order a large dark roast. I'd get my usual vanilla latte, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. I learned that he was passionate about environmental conservation, that he taught himself to cook during the pandemic, and that he had a complicated relationship with his own family. Sometimes I feel like people see what they want to see, he told me during our third meeting. Like they've already decided who I am based on surface level stuff, and nothing I do can change that perception. I understood that feeling intimately. It's like being permanently cast in a role you never auditioned for, I said. Exactly. His eyes lit up with recognition. With you, I feel like I can just be David, not anyone's expectation of who David should be. I felt the exact same way. In those Thursday afternoon conversations, I wasn't the overlooked daughter or the successful but invisible engineer. I was just Maxine talking to David about life, dreams, and the small observations that make ordinary moments meaningful. Neither of us mentioned our jobs in any specific detail. I knew he worked in tech and he knew I was a software engineer, but the details seemed less important than the connection we were building. Looking back, I realized those early conversations were the first time I felt truly seen by someone outside of my professional sphere. David wasn't impressed by my achievements or disappointed by my perceived failures. He was simply interested in who I was as a person. That feeling was addictive. The handwritten note arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under my apartment door sometime during the night. In David's careful script, "Thank you for seeing me, not my reputation." I stared at the words, puzzled. What reputation? To me, David was just the thoughtful man who remembered how I liked my coffee and always asked follow-up questions about things I mentioned weeks earlier. Our Thursday meetings had evolved into something deeper than casual conversation. We'd started taking walks after coffee, wandering through the nearby park while discussing everything from childhood, memories to philosophical questions about success and happiness. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," David said, during one of these walks, about feeling like you're living someone else's script for your life. I had shared more with him than I'd intended, opening up about my family dynamics in ways I rarely did with anyone. Something about his steady presence made vulnerability feel safe. "I think that's why I'm drawn to you," he continued. "You don't seem to want anything from me except genuine connection. That's rare in my experience." I wondered about that comment, but didn't press. David had a way of making cryptic statements about his life, and I'd learned to respect his privacy, the same way he respected mine. What I did know was that our connection was unlike anything I'd experienced. He had this way of asking questions that made me think differently about my own life. When I complained about feeling invisible in my family, he gently challenged me to consider whether I was making myself invisible in other areas too. "You're brilliant, Maxine," he said one afternoon as we sat on a park bench. "But you minimize yourself in every conversation. You say just before describing your accomplishments, like you're apologizing for being successful." He was right. I'd say just. Constantly, I'm just a software engineer. I just work on some apps. I just got lucky with my career. I'd never noticed the pattern until he pointed it out. "Why do you think you do that?" he asked. I thought about it for a long moment. Because growing up, my achievements made other people uncomfortable. It was easier to downplay them than to deal with the resentment. "But what if you stopped?" he asked. "What if you owned your success instead of apologizing for it?" These conversations were changing me in ways I hadn't expected. David's perspective helped me see patterns I'd been blind to for years. More importantly, his consistent presence was teaching me that not everyone would punish me for being successful or intelligent. "I have to confess something," he said one evening as we walked back to our cars. "I've been dreading the day when you Google me and everything changes." "Google you?" I laughed. "David, I don't even know your last name." The look on his face was so vulnerable that I immediately regretted making light of it. "Chen," he said quietly. "David Chen." The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Should I know that name? Most people do, he said with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I founded Next Tech Solutions 15 years ago. We went public 5 years ago, and since then, my life has been complicated by people who are more interested in my net worth than my personality. Next Tech Solutions. I did know that name, their cloud computing platform, was revolutionary, and their stock performance had been legendary, which meant David wasn't just successful. He was extraordinarily wealthy. You're telling me this because you think it will change how I see you? I asked. Doesn't it? I considered his question seriously. Did it change things? The man walking beside me was still the same person who cleaned up coffee with me, who listened to my stories with genuine interest, who made me feel valued for who I was rather than what I achieved. The only thing that changes is that I understand why you've been so careful about privacy, I said, and why you wrote that note about reputation. The relief on his face was immediate and profound. Most people either want something from me, or they get intimidated and pull away. I was terrified you'd do one or the other. I'm not most people, I said, surprised by my own confidence. No, he agreed, taking my hand for the first time. You're definitely not. The engagement ring wasn't flashy as simple. Platinum band with a single diamond that caught the light without demanding attention. David had chosen it carefully, knowing that I'd value meaning over spectacle. I love you, he said on that quiet Sunday morning in his apartment, not because of what you've accomplished or what you might become, but because of who you are right now, in this moment. We were making breakfast together, a routine that had developed over the months since he revealed his identity. I was scrambling eggs while he made coffee, and the proposal came so naturally that it felt like a continuation of our ongoing conversation about building a life together. I know this might seem fast, he continued, but I've never been more certain about anything. Will you marry me? I set down the spatula and really looked at him. This man who had seen me through my mother's diagnosis, who had listened to me cry about family dynamics without trying to fix anything, who had encouraged me to value myself in ways I never learned. Yes, I said simply, because anything else would have been overthinking. We talked for hours that morning about what marriage would mean for both of us. David had been through the public scrutiny that came with high-profile relationships, and he understood my need for privacy given my complicated family situation. I want to protect what we have, he said. Once the media gets involved, everything changes. People start analyzing every interaction, every decision. I don't want that pressure on us while we're still figuring out how to be married. I agreed, completely. The idea of my family's sudden interest in my personal life, motivated by David's wealth rather than genuine care, made me feel sick. I wanted time to adjust to being a wife before becoming a curiosity. What if we kept it private for a while? I suggested. Just until we're ready to deal with the complications. A secret marriage? He smiled. I like the sound of that. We planned everything for the following week. No fanfare, no guest list. No elaborate ceremony that would inevitably become about everything except our commitment to each other. Just us, two witnesses David knew and trusted, and a judge who specialized in discreet ceremonies for high-profile clients. The courthouse was quiet on that Tuesday morning. I wore a simple blue dress I'd bought the day before, and David wore a dark suit that made him look more serious than I'd ever seen him. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to see each other clearly, to support each other's growth, and to build something better together than either of us could create alone. I never thought I'd want to be married. I told him during the brief ceremony. But I've never wanted to be seen the way you see me. I've never trusted anyone enough to be completely myself with them, he replied. Until you. The judge pronounced us husband and wife, and we kissed while the two witnesses applauded quietly. Afterward, we went to lunch at the same coffee shop, where we'd first met, ordering the same drinks and sitting at the same table. So, Mrs. Chen, David said, testing out the name. I'm keeping Richardson professionally, I said, but I like the sound of that in private. We talked about practical things, merging some finances while keeping our independence. adjusting our living situations, navigating the eventual revelation to our families. But mostly, we just enjoyed the quiet joy of being newlyweds without anyone else's expectations or opinions. No regrets? David asked as we prepared to leave. None, I said, meaning it completely. You? Only that we waited so long to make it official. That evening, we had dinner at his apartment, our apartment now, though I'd keep my place for appearances. We talked about the future, about when and how we'd tell our families, about what it meant to be building something together that was entirely ours. The ring felt strange on my finger, but in the best possible way. It was a tangible reminder that someone had chosen me, not despite my complexities, but because of them. Claire's Instagram feed told a carefully curated story of success and happiness. Designer handbags, exotic vacations, gourmet dinners at trendy restaurants, all funded by increasingly frequent loans from our parents that everyone pretended would be repaid. Someday. What the glossy photos didn't show was the mounting desperation behind Claire's lifestyle. At 36, she had never held a steady job for more than 18 months. Her pattern was predictable. Charm her way into a position, coast on personality for a few months, then quit dramatically when actual work was expected. I'm just not meant for corporate culture, she'd explain to anyone who'd listen. I'm more of an entrepreneur. Her entrepreneurial ventures included a short-lived jewelry business that sold exactly 3 pieces, a lifestyle blog that attracted 12 followers, and a brief stint as a social media influencer that ended when she couldn't attract enough sponsors to sustain her posting schedule. Through it all, Mom and Dad enabled her with a combination of financial support and elaborate excuses. Dad's construction company had been struggling for years, but somehow there was always money for Claire's latest crisis. Her car payment, her rent, her credit card debt, it all flowed through the family finances like water through a sieve. Meanwhile, I learned about Dad's business troubles through a casual comment from his accountant, whom I'd run into at the grocery store. The man looked uncomfortable when he realized he'd mentioned something I didn't know about. I'm sure your father will figure something out, he said quickly. He's been through tough times before. That night, I called Dad directly. Why didn't you tell me the company was having problems? It's nothing for you to worry about, he said dismissively. Just the usual ups and downs of the construction business. Claire's been helping me think through some solutions. Claire, who had never shown interest in construction or business, was suddenly his consultant. The same Claire who'd once asked. New-eyed companies needed to pay taxes if they were already making money. I offered to help. I had savings, investment knowledge, and analytical skills that could actually address his problems. But Dad brushed off my suggestions with the same tone he'd used when I was 13 and trying to explain why our family computer was running slowly. This isn't really your area, sweetheart. You're good with computers, but business is different. The irony was staggering. I managed a significant investment portfolio, understood market analysis, and had helped quantum dynamics navigate several complex financial decisions. But somehow Claire, who had never balanced her own checkbook, was the business expert. Mom's health had been declining for months before anyone told me how serious it was. I discovered the extent of her condition during a routine call when she mentioned casually that she'd had to postpone a treatment appointment. Treatment for what? I asked. The silence stretched too long. Oh, honey, didn't Claire tell you? I have some heart issues that need monitoring. Heart issues. As if it were something minor that would resolve itself. When I pressed for details, I learned that Mom needed surgery that would cost far more than their insurance would cover. The same insurance that had been paying for Claire's therapy sessions and prescription medications for anxiety. That seemed to flare up whenever she needed time off work. We're handling it, Mom assured me. Claire has been wonderful about managing all the appointments and paperwork. I wanted to scream. Claire was managing things the same way she managed everything else, by letting other people handle the difficult parts while taking credit for caring. I was willing to bet that Mom's medical appointments conflicted with Claire's social schedule more often than not. The family dynamic had always been toxic, but Mom's illness brought the dysfunction into sharp focus. Claire positioned herself as the devoted daughter while actually being almost entirely absent for the day-to-day challenges. She'd show up for doctor visits when there might be important information to hear, but she was mysteriously unavailable for the tedious tasks like picking up prescriptions or driving Mom to routine appointments. Maxine lived so far away. Claire would say to anyone who'd listen, "It's really hard for her to help with day-to-day stuff." I lived 90 minutes away. Claire lived 20 minutes away. But somehow geography became an excuse for my absence while Claire's physical proximity was evidence of her devotion. The truth was becoming clear. I had been cast as the selfish, distant daughter while Claire played the role of the caring, present. 1. The fact that I was offering real, practical help while Claire was offering performative sympathy didn't matter to the family narrative. Mom's handwritten will was dated 3 weeks before her death, written in the shaky script that had replaced her once elegant handwriting. The lawyer read it aloud in his sterile conference room while Claire, Dad, and I sat in uncomfortable silence. To my daughters, Claire and Maxine, he read, "I leave my estate in equal shares, hoping this will encourage the relationship I was never able to foster between them." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, unmistakable anger. "Equal shares?" she said, her voice rising. "That can't be right. Mom always said, I've been the one taking care of everything." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I suspected he'd known about the will's contents and had been dreading this moment. The estate wasn't enormous, but it included the family home, Mom's jewelry, and a modest savings account that Claire had probably already spent in her mind. "There must be an older version," Claire continued, turning to the lawyer. "Something from before she was so medicated." "This doesn't make sense." The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, had known our family for 20 years. He'd watched Claire grow up expecting everything to be handed to her, and his expression suggested he wasn't entirely surprised by her reaction. "This is the most recent will," he said calmly. "Your mother was very clear about her intentions when she came to update it. She specifically mentioned wanting to ensure both daughters were treated fairly." I sat quietly, processing the implications. Mom had made this decision during her final weeks, when she was most vulnerable and probably most honest about family dynamics. It felt like a posthumous acknowledgement of everything that had been ignored for decades. "But I've been here," Claire said, her voice becoming more desperate. "I've been handling everything while Maxine was off living her separate life. Mom knew I needed the stability more than she does." There it was, the expectation that had always lurked beneath the surface. Claire didn't just expect inheritance. She felt entitled to it because she positioned herself as the needy one. In her mind, my independence and success were reasons why I deserve less, not evidence that I'd earned my autonomy. Dad finally spoke up. "Claire, your mother made her decision. We have to respect that." "Respect it?" Claire turned on him with fury I'd rarely seen from her. "Dad, I can't afford to lose this house. Where am I supposed to live? What am I supposed to do?" The question hung in the air, highlighting everything that was wrong with the family dynamic. At 36, Claire had never developed a plan for self-sufficiency. She'd always assumed that family resources would be available to support her lifestyle indefinitely. I found my voice finally. "Claire, we can talk about the house. If you want to buy out my share, we can work something out." "Buy you out?" She laughed bitterly. "With what money, Maxine? I don't have your tech job and your savings account. Some of us have had to struggle." Bleh. Accusation was absurd. Claire's struggle consisted of bouncing between low-commitment jobs while living in our parents' house rent-free and having her expenses subsidized by people who'd worked hard their entire lives. "I've offered to help with Dad's business problems," I said quietly. "I've offered to help with Mom's medical expenses. You've never wanted my help before." "Help?" Claire's voice was getting louder. "You mean taking over like you always do? Coming in with your solutions and making the rest of us feel stupid?" I was stunned by the venom in her voice. This wasn't grief or disappointment about the inheritance. This was years of resentment spilling out. "I don't think," I started. "You don't think what? That you make people feel small? That you walk around acting like you're better than us because you understand computers and we don't?" Dad looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Mr. Patterson was pretending to review paperwork, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. I've never acted like I'm better than anyone, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I've tried to help when I can, and I've stayed out of the way when you've made it clear my help isn't wanted. Staying out of the way, Claire repeated mockingly. Is that what you call abandoning your family? The accusation hit harder than I expected. Despite everything, despite years of feeling overlooked and undervalued, I still carry guilt about not being present enough. Claire knew exactly where to aim her words for maximum damage. The will stands as written, Mr. Patterson interjected, clearly sensing the conversation was spiraling. If you'd like to discuss arrangements about the property, I suggest you do, so privately and let me know how you'd like to proceed legally. As we left the office, Claire shot me a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, Maxine? Mom wasn't thinking clearly at the end, and everyone knows it, but I knew better. Mom's final decision was probably the clearest thinking she'd done about our family in years. The hospital bracelet from Mom's final admission is still in my jewelry box, a plastic reminder of truths that emerged too late. During those last weeks when the pretenses fell away and only honesty remained, I finally understood how clearly she had seen our family dynamics. I had quietly taken over Mom's medical expenses months before her death, after learning that Dad's insurance wasn't covering the specialized treatment she needed. The cardiac surgery alone cost more than Dad made in 6 months, and the follow-up care was an ongoing financial drain that was destroying what little stability their finances had left. When I offered to help, Dad's pride initially kicked in. We can't accept that kind of money from you, honey. It wouldn't be right. Dad, I can afford it, I said gently. And Mom needs the best care available. Let me do this for her. What I didn't say was that I'd already researched the doctors, the procedures, and the recovery process. I'd identified the best cardiac surgeon in the state and had quietly made arrangements for Mom to be transferred to his care. The financial conversations were just catching up to decisions I already made. Claire, predictably, was nowhere to be found when the hard conversations needed to happen. She'd appear for the dramatic moments, the initial diagnosis, the pre-surgery consultations where decisions were made, but she was always too busy or too overwhelmed to handle the practical details. I just can't handle seeing her in pain, Claire would say, tears streaming down her face, and performances worthy of an Oscar. It breaks my heart too much to be there for the difficult stuff. So I became the daughter who sat through insurance, calls, who researched treatment options, who asked the hard questions about prognosis and quality of life. I was the one who noticed when Mom wasn't eating enough, who advocated for better pain management, who slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair during the nights when her condition was unstable, during one of those long nights. When Mom was finally comfortable enough to talk, she reached for my hand. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice weak but clear. For what? For not seeing you, she said simply. For letting Claire's noise drown out your quiet strength. I've watched you these past months, and I've realized how wrong I was about both of my daughters. I felt tears starting, emotions I'd kept carefully controlled throughout the medical crisis finally surfacing. Claire has always needed more attention, Mom continued. She's been that way since she was little, dramatic, demanding, unable to handle not being the center of everything. I thought I was helping her by giving her what she needed. You were trying to be a good mother, I said. But I wasn't being a good mother to you, she replied. I let you raise yourself because you seemed so capable, so independent. I told myself you didn't need the same kind of support Claire did, but you were a child too. You needed to know you were valued. The conversation we were having should have happened 20 years earlier, but I was grateful it was happening at all. You become remarkable despite my failures, not because of them, Mom said. You're kind, brilliant, successful, and strong. And I'm sorry it took me being sick to really see that. Over the following weeks, as Mom's condition worsened, she became increasingly vocal about the family dynamic she'd previously ignored. When Claire would show up for visiting hours with dramatic displays of grief, Mom would gently but firmly redirect the conversation. Claire, honey, could you please go update the nurses about Maxine's contact information? She's been handling the medical decisions, and they need to know how to reach her. When relatives called to check on Mom's condition, she made sure they understood who was actually providing care. Maxine has been wonderful, she'd tell anyone who'd listen. I don't know what we would have done without her handling everything. It was the recognition I wanted my entire life, finally coming when it was almost too late to matter, during her final week. When the doctors made it clear that recovery wasn't possible, Mom called me to her bedside for one last conversation. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything?" "Don't let Claire make you feel guilty for taking care of yourself. She's going to try because that's how she operates. But you deserve happiness, Maxine. You deserve love and respect and all the good things life can offer." I promised, not knowing. How prophetic her words would prove to be. Mom died on a Tuesday morning while I was holding her hand and Claire was at a yoga class she couldn't reschedule. The funeral home receipts tell a story that no one else witnessed. Every expense, from the casket to the flowers to the catered reception, paid for by my credit card while Claire orchestrated the arrangements as if she were funding them herself. "I want everything to be perfect for Mom," Claire announced during our first meeting with the funeral director. "Cost isn't an issue, we want the best of everything." She spoke with the authority of someone who had always assumed family resources. We're infinite, gesturing grandly at premium options while I quietly took notes about actual logistics. The funeral director, experienced in reading family dynamics, kept glancing between us as if trying to figure out who was actually making the decisions. "The mahogany casket is beautiful," Claire continued, "and I love the idea of white roses, Mom. Always said they were elegant." I found myself in the surreal position of nodding along while mentally calculating costs. The casket alone was more than many people's cars, but Claire was picking options based on aesthetics rather than budgets. "Will this be paid for today or?" the funeral director began. "My sister will handle the paperwork," Claire said smoothly, not even looking at me. "I'm too emotional to deal with financial details right now." Too emotional, but not too emotional, to specify that she wanted premium everything. I handed over my credit card and signed the forms while Claire excused herself to take what she described as an urgent call about flower arrangements. The pattern continued throughout the week. Claire would make grand pronouncements about what Mom would have wanted, then disappear when implementation was required. She selected the music, the readings, the menu for the reception, all excellent choices that showcased her event planning instincts, but left me to coordinate with vendors, confirm details, and manage the endless logistics of death in America. David helped where he could, though I was careful about how much I involved him. He understood my need to handle this myself, but he also recognized the emotional toll of managing everything alone. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself," he said one evening as I worked through vendor contracts at the kitchen table. "It's easier this way," I replied. "Claire handles the emotional performance, and I handle the practical stuff. It's how our family has always worked, but it's not fair to you." He was right, but fairness had never been a priority in Richardson family dynamics. What mattered was getting through the funeral with dignity intact and Mom properly honored. The most challenging aspect wasn't the logistics. It was watching Claire gradually position herself as the primary griever. Family friends who called to offer condolences were directed to Claire's phone number. She posted thoughtful social media tributes that generated hundreds of sympathetic comments. She scheduled herself for all the visible, emotionally significant tasks while I handled the invisible work that actually made everything function. 2 days before the funeral, I realized Claire had never asked about the total cost. She was planning a memorial service that cost more than many weddings without any curiosity about who was funding it. "Claire, we should talk about expenses," I said during one of our planning sessions. "Oh, don't worry about that now," she said dismissively. "We can figure out money stuff later. This is about honoring Mom." Later, always later with Claire, as if financial realities would somehow resolve themselves through the power of positive thinking. The morning of the funeral, I arrived early to coordinate with the caterers and confirm final details. Claire arrived An hour later, looking perfectly put together in a designer black dress I'd never seen before, probably purchased specifically for the occasion. "Everything looks beautiful," she said, surveying the arrangements with satisfaction. "Mom would have loved this." She was right, everything did look beautiful. The flowers were elegant, the music was meaningful, and the reception space was tastefully arranged. Claire had excellent instincts for creating emotionally appropriate experiences, but as family members began arriving and offering their condolences, I watched Claire seamlessly step into the role of primary host. She greeted everyone warmly, accepted sympathy with gracious composure, and spoke eloquently about Mom's legacy. Meanwhile, I stood slightly apart, handling the practical questions from vendors and making sure everything ran smoothly. Family friends who had known me since childhood offered brief, polite condolences before gravitating toward Claire's more dramatic grief. David arrived quietly and positioned himself respectfully in the background, exactly as we discussed. He understood that today wasn't about our relationship, it was about saying goodbye to Mom with dignity. As the service began, I felt this strange disconnect of having organized every detail while feeling like a guest at someone else's event. Claire had somehow transformed my planning and my payment into her tribute to Mom. But looking at the beautiful service, surrounded by people who had loved Mom, I realized that the recognition didn't matter. What mattered was that we were honoring her memory appropriately, and that I had been able to give her the goodbye she deserved. The receipts in my wallet were just paper. The real accounting would come later. The tissue box on the funeral home's side table had been strategically placed for moments exactly like this one, but no amount of preparation could have readied me for the cruelty of Claire's words. The service had concluded beautifully. Friends and family had shared warm memories of Mom. The music had been perfect, and the overall tone had been celebratory of a life well lived rather than mournful. People were beginning to move toward the reception area when Claire cornered me near the front of the chapel. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I assumed she wanted to discuss reception, logistics, or thank me for organizing everything. Instead, she positioned herself so that several family members were within earshot and launched into an attack that left me breathless. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she began, her voice carrying just enough volume to attract attention without seeming intentionally dramatic. "What are you talking about?" "Playing the martyr as usual. Swooping in with your money and your solutions, making the rest of us look bad. Mom's funeral isn't supposed to be about showcasing how successful you are." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. "Claire, I just wanted Mom to have a beautiful service by paying for everything yourself, by making sure everyone knows you're the responsible daughter while I'm just the emotional one." Her voice was getting louder, drawing more attention from family members who had paused their conversations to listen. "I never said, you didn't have to say anything. Your actions speak loud enough. Poor Claire can't handle the practical stuff. Poor Claire needs Maxine to swoop in and save the day with her tech money." The unfairness of the accusation was staggering. I had deliberately stayed in the background, letting Claire take credit for all the planning decisions while quietly handling the execution. But somehow, my discretion had been transformed into manipulation in her mind. "Claire, that's not what happened," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the attention we were attracting. "Isn't it?" She stepped closer, and I could see years of resentment crystallizing in her expression. "You've always done this, Maxine. You act like you're helping, but really you're just showing off how much better you are than everyone else." "Family?" Members were openly staring now. Dad looked uncomfortable but made no move to intervene. Our aunts and uncles exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't entirely surprising behavior from Claire. "I was trying to honor Mom," I said quietly. "Honor Mom?" Claire's laugh was bitter and loud. "Mom spent her whole life worrying about you, wondering why you couldn't just be normal. Why you always had to be so different and difficult." The words hit like physical blows. This wasn't grief talking. This was calculated cruelty designed to inflict maximum damage at my most vulnerable moment. "That's not true," I whispered. "Isn't it? Mom used to cry about you, Maxine. About how you'd ended up so cold and distant. how you'd probably end up alone because you can't connect with people normally. I felt tears starting, which only seemed to encourage Claire's attack. "Face it, Maxine," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the chapel. "You'll die alone just like you've lived unwanted and unremarkable. All the money in the world can't buy you the kind of love and connection that comes naturally to other people." The silence that followed was deafening. Family members stared at the floor, embarrassed by the spectacle, but unwilling to intervene. Dad looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. I stood there, publicly humiliated at my own mother's funeral, feeling every insecurity I'd ever had about myself, confirmed in front of people who had known me since childhood. Claire's words had found every vulnerable spot and pressed hard. "I can't do this," I managed to say, and started toward the exit. "That's right," Claire called after me. "Run away like you always do when things get real." I made it to the parking lot before the tears really started. Leaning against my car, I fumbled for tissues and tried to process what had just happened. Claire had used my mother's funeral as a stage for public humiliation, weaponizing my deepest fears about being unlovable. The worst part was that some of what she'd said felt true. I did have trouble connecting with people. I was different, awkward in social situations, more comfortable with computers than conversations. Maybe Mom had worried about me. Maybe I was destined to be alone. I was so lost in my own pain that I didn't notice David approaching until he touched my shoulder. "Maxine?" I looked up, embarrassed to be seen crying, but grateful he was there. "You heard all of that?" "I heard enough," he said softly. "Are you okay?" I wasn't okay. I felt like Claire had reached into my chest and torn out every fear I'd ever had about myself, displaying them for everyone to see. But looking at David's kind, concerned face, I realized that her cruelest accusation that I would die alone was simply wrong. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. My wedding ring had been hidden in my jewelry box for months, worn only in private moments when David and I were alone together. But as I stood in that parking lot, devastated by Claire's public cruelty, I slipped it onto my finger for the first time in public. "I should go back in," I said, wiping my eyes with tissues David handed me. "People will be expecting me at the reception." "Only if you want to," he said gently. "You don't owe anyone your presence after what just happened." I did want to go back, though not because I felt obligated, but because leaving would feel like letting Claire's cruelty drive me away from honoring Mom's memory. The reception was as much about celebrating Mom's life as the service had been. "Will you come with me?" I asked. "I mean, will you sit with me instead of in the background?" David studied my face carefully. "Are you sure? Once people see us together, there will be questions." "I'm tired of hiding," I said, surprised by my own certainty. "Claire just told everyone I'll die alone. I'd like them to know that's not true." We walked back into the funeral home together, and I felt the shift in energy. Immediately, David's presence beside me, confident, supportive, clearly protective, changed how people perceived me. I wasn't the pathetic figure Claire had painted. I was a woman with someone who cared enough to stand with me during my most difficult moments. Claire was holding court near the reception table, accepting condolences and sharing memories of Mom with a group of family friends. She glanced up as David and I entered, and I saw her expression change from satisfaction to confusion as she registered his presence beside me. "Maxine," Aunt Linda approached us with obvious relief. "I'm so glad you came back." That was well. Emotions run high at funerals, don't they? It was a gentle way of acknowledging what had happened without directly criticizing Claire, and I appreciated her diplomatic approach. "Aunt Linda, I'd like you to meet David," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "David, this is my aunt, Linda, Mom's sister." David extended his hand with genuine warmth. "I'm sorry for your loss. Maxine has told me wonderful stories about her mother." "David," Aunt Linda repeated, studying his face with the careful attention older women applied to their niece's romantic interests. How do you know Maxine?" Before I could answer, David stepped slightly closer to me in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. "Maxine is my wife," he said simply. The words carried across the space more effectively than any announcement could have. Conversations paused as people processed what they'd just heard. I saw heads turning, whispers starting, and Claire's face going through a series of expressions that would have been comical in any other context. Your wife? Aunt Linda's voice rose with surprise and delight. Maxine, honey, why didn't you tell us you were married? It was recent, I said, which was true enough. We've been keeping it private. Dad appeared at my shoulder, having clearly overheard the conversation. He looked at David with the assessing expression he perfected over years of meeting Claire's. Various boyfriends. Dad, this is David Chen, my husband, I said, watching his face carefully. David, my father, Robert Richardson. David shook Dad's hand with respectful firmness. Mr. Richardson, I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances. Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Dad said slowly, still processing the information. And how long have you two been? We met about a year ago, David said. The marriage is recent, but I've never been more certain about anything in my life. I watched Dad's expression change as he absorbed David's confidence and obvious devotion. This wasn't some casual boyfriend Claire might have brought to the funeral for drama. This was a man who spoke about marriage with the gravity it deserved. Well, Dad said finally, I wish your mother could have met him, Maxine. The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate congratulations would have. Dad was acknowledging that David was someone Mom would have approved of, someone worthy of being introduced to the family. Across the room, I could see Claire processing the shift in dynamics. The daughter she just publicly humiliated as destined to die alone was revealing herself to be married to someone who clearly adored her. The narrative she constructed was crumbling in real time, but more importantly, I felt something shifting. Inside myself, standing there with David's steady presence beside me, accepting congratulations from family members who were seeing me in an entirely new light, I realized that Claire's opinion of my worth didn't actually matter. For the first time in my life, I had someone whose opinion mattered more than my family's judgment. David saw me clearly, my strengths, my flaws, my potential, and had chosen to build a life with me. That reality was stronger than any cruel words Claire could weaponize. Thank you, I whispered to David as we moved through the reception, accepting surprise congratulations and answering gentle questions about our relationship. For what? For not letting me stand alone. He squeezed my hand, the wedding ring catching the light for everyone to see. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Never. Having to stand alone again. David's business card was elegant in its simplicity, cream-colored stock with David Chen, founder and CEO, Next Solutions, and understated typography. But the impact it had on my family was anything but understated. The shift in energy was gradual. At first, during the reception, people began gravitating toward David and me with renewed interest. Family members who had offered perfunctory condolences earlier now wanted extended conversations. Suddenly, everyone remembered fond stories about how proud Mom had been of my achievements. I always knew Maxine would do well for herself, Uncle Jim announced, despite having spent years referring to my career as computer stuff. With barely concealed dismissal. Claire watched from across the room, her confusion growing more apparent as the afternoon progressed. She positioned herself to receive sympathy and attention as the grieving daughter, but the dynamic was shifting toward David, and me in ways she couldn't understand. It was Cousin Sarah who finally asked the question. That was on everyone's mind. David, what kind of work do you do? She asked during a lull in conversation. I work in technology, David replied with the same diplomatic vagueness he'd always used when discussing his career. Oh, like Maxine, Sarah said brightly. Are you a programmer too? More on the business side, David said. I founded a company that develops cloud computing solutions. The name Nextech hadn't come up yet, but I could see Claire approaching our conversation with obvious curiosity. She'd been trying to insert herself into our discussions all afternoon, clearly fishing for information about this mysterious husband who had appeared from nowhere. A startup? Claire interjected, positioning herself in our circle with practiced social maneuvering. How exciting. Is it doing well? David glanced at me and I could see him making a decision about how much to reveal. We've been fortunate. He said simply, "What's the company called?" Claire pressed, her journalist instincts finally kicking in despite her general disinterest in technology. Next Solutions, David said. The name hit different people at different speeds. Uncle Jim, who followed financial news religiously, went very still. Cousin Sarah looked blank. Technology companies weren't her area of interest, but Claire's expression changed immediately from curiosity to sharp attention. Next Solutions, she repeated slowly. As in the cloud computing company that went public a few years ago? That's right, David confirmed. I watched the mathematical calculation happening behind Claire's eyes. She was remembering news stories, stock prices, the kind of wealth that came with founding a successful tech company. Her face went through confusion, disbelief, and finally, something approaching shock. "Wait," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Are you the David Chen?" "The one who's worth," she stopped herself, but the question hung in the air. "I prefer not to discuss finances at family gatherings," David said with gentle firmness, but the deflection was answer enough. The silence that followed was profound. Uncle Jim was staring at David with a newfound respect. Cousin Sarah was pulling out her phone, undoubtedly to Google Next Solutions. Other family members were beginning to tune into our conversation as word spread. Claire looked like she'd been hit by a truck. The sister she'd just publicly humiliated as destined to die alone had revealed herself to be married to one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on her face. "Maxine," Dad said quietly, approaching our group with an expression I'd never seen before. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer. "Because I wanted people to get to know David for who he is, not what he's accomplished," I said. "And because our relationship isn't about his success, it's about how we see each other." Dad nodded slowly, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about my life and my choices. The daughter he dismissed as socially awkward and career-focused had somehow attracted and married someone whose success dwarfed anything the Richardson family had ever imagined. "Mom would have been so proud," he said finally, and I heard genuine emotion in his voice. The comment hit harder than I'd expected. Mom would have been proud not just of David's accomplishments, but of the fact that I'd found someone who valued me. She'd worried about my social connections, and here was proof that her concerns had been unfounded. Claire excused herself abruptly, mumbling something about needing air. I watched her leave, recognizing the look of someone whose entire worldview was being reorganized against her will. For the rest of the reception, I experienced something I'd never felt before at a family gathering: genuine interest in my life and choices. People wanted to know how David and I had met, what our plans were, how long we'd been keeping the marriage secret. But the most meaningful moment came when Dad pulled me aside as the afternoon was winding down. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've spent years treating your success like it was somehow less important than Claire's needs. I was wrong about a lot of things." "Dad, no, let me finish. Your mother saw it before I did. She told me during her last week that you'd become the kind of person she'd always hoped you'd be, and that I'd been too blind to see it." The conversation I'd had with Mom about Dad's opinion came flooding back, along with her prediction that someday he'd understand. She'd been right, as she'd been about so many things. Looking around the reception at family members who were seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time, I realized that Claire's cruel words had backfired completely. Instead of humiliating me, she created the context for a revelation that changed everything. My childhood diary was buried in a box in my closet, pages filled with the careful handwriting of a girl trying to make sense of feeling invisible in her own family. David found me reading it the week after Mom's funeral, sitting on our bedroom floor surrounded by memories I'd packed away years ago. Age 10, I read aloud from a random entry. "Claire got picked for the school play today. Mom and Dad are so excited they're already planning to invite all the relatives to come watch. I got an A+ on my science project, but when I told them, At dinner, Dad just said, "That's nice," and went back to talking about Claire's costume. David sat down beside me, careful not to disturb the papers spread around me. "How long have you been reading those?" "Hours," I admitted. "I keep thinking I was exaggerating the family dynamics in my memory, but it's all here. Page after page of feeling invisible, of wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't get their attention." The entries were painful to read as an adult. I could see the patterns so clearly now, a child desperately trying to understand why her achievements didn't matter, why her sister's ordinary accomplishments were celebrated while her exceptional ones were ignored. Age 12, I continued. Reading. Claire failed her math test again, but Mom says she's creatively minded, and math isn't important for artistic people. I got the highest score in my grade on the same test, but nobody mentioned it. Sometimes I wonder if I could disappear, and they wouldn't notice for weeks. "Maxine," David said gently, "you don't have to torture yourself with this." "But I do," I said, tears starting. Because Claire was right about some things, I did become cold and distant. I did have trouble connecting with people. These patterns started when I was a child, and they shaped who I became. David was quiet for a moment, letting me process the emotions that were surfacing. Finally, he spoke. "Do you think you're cold and distant with me?" The question surprised me. "No, but are you cold and distant with your colleagues? With the people who know you in professional settings?" "No, but that's different." "How is it different?" I thought about his questions seriously. At work, I was known for being collaborative, supportive, and emotionally intelligent. My colleagues sought my advice on both technical and personal matters. I mentored junior engineers with patience and genuine care. "I guess I'm only cold and distant with people who make me feel like I have to be," I said slowly. "Like your family." "Like my family," I agreed. I learned to protect myself by not showing how much their indifference hurt. But somewhere along the way, self-protection became my default mode. David picked up another diary entry. Age 14. Claire brought home a C+ on her history paper, and Dad took her out for ice cream to celebrate her improvement. I brought home notification that I'd been accepted to a summer program at the university, and Dad asked if it would interfere with helping at his construction sites. "They taught you that your achievements didn't matter," David said, "so you stopped sharing them." That's not being cold. That's surviving emotional neglect. The realization hit hard. I'd spent years believing Claire's narrative that I was inherently flawed, socially awkward, destined to be alone. But the truth was more complex. I developed protective behaviors in response to a family system that consistently undervalued me. "I was thinking about what you said," I told David, "about minimizing my accomplishments. I realized I do it because growing up, talking about my success made other people uncomfortable. Claire would get jealous. Dad would feel inadequate, Mom would worry I was becoming arrogant. So you learn to make yourself smaller." Exactly. And after 34 years of practice, I'd forgotten how to be any other way. David reached for my hand. "What would it look like if you stopped making yourself smaller?" I considered the question. Terrifying, liberating, I don't know. We spent the evening talking about patterns I developed in childhood and how they'd shaped my adult relationships. David's patient questions helped me see that my so-called social difficulties weren't character flaws. They were learned responses to a family system that had never felt safe. "When you first told me about your family," David said, "you described them like they were normal and you were the problem. But normal families don't make children feel invisible. Normal families celebrate all their children's achievements." "I know that intellectually," I said. "But emotionally, I still feel like the problem was me." "That's what children do," David said gently. "They blame themselves for family dysfunction because it feels less scary than accepting that the adults, who are supposed to protect them, aren't doing their job." The conversation was painful but necessary. For the first time, I was examining my childhood with adult eyes instead of accepting the family narrative that had been handed to me. "Claire said Mom used to cry about me," I said, remembering the cruel words from the funeral. "Do you believe that?" I thought about my final conversations with Mom, about her apologies for not seeing me clearly, about her recognition of my strength and accomplishments. No, I think that was Claire projecting her own fears onto Mom's memory. What do you think Mom would want for you now? The answer came without hesitation. She'd want me to stop apologizing for being successful. She'd want me to build a life. With people who see my value, she'd want me to be happy. David smiled. Then maybe it's time to start listening to what she actually wanted instead of what Claire claimed she wanted. That night, I put the diary entries away, but I kept the insights. They provided. Understanding my past didn't erase the pain, but it helped me see that my future could be different. The text messages started 3 days after the funeral, beginning with what seemed like genuine remorse and escalating into increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation. I saved them all, creating an unintentional documentary of Claire's psychological journey from shock to manipulation. Maxine, I'm so sorry about what I said at the funeral. I was grieving and not thinking clearly. Can we talk? The first message arrived at 6:23 a.m., suggesting she'd been awake all night processing the previous day's revelations. I didn't respond immediately, needing time to think about whether I wanted to engage at all. By noon, the tone had shifted. I know you're probably angry, but we're family. Mom wouldn't want us to let this come between us. David seems lovely, by the way. I'd love to get to know him better. The calculated mention of David confirmed my suspicions about her motivations. This wasn't about repairing our relationship, it was about gaining access to the wealth and connections she'd just discovered. Please call me. I feel terrible about how things went yesterday. I want to make it right. Maxine, you can't just ignore me forever. We need to talk about the house situation anyway. I'm worried about you. This silent treatment isn't healthy for either of us. The messages came every few hours, each one revealing more about Claire's thought process. She was cycling through different emotional manipulations, guilt, family obligation, false concern for my well-being, trying to find the approach that would get her what she wanted. David read them over my shoulder as I scrolled through the latest batch. She's persistent, he said diplomatically. She's desperate, I corrected. Claire's probably been researching your company's valuation and realizing what kind of life she could have access to if she plays this right. What do you want to do? I considered my options. Ignoring Claire indefinitely wasn't sustainable. We'd have to interact about settling Mom's estate regardless of our personal relationship. But engaging with her felt like walking into a trap designed to exploit my guilt and family loyalty. I think I need to respond, I said finally. But on my terms, not hers. Before I could change my mind, I typed, Claire, I need some time to process what happened at Mom's funeral. When I'm ready to talk, I'll reach out. Please respect that boundary. Her response came within minutes. Of course. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I love you and I'm here when you're ready. Family is everything, right? The message was perfectly crafted to sound supportive while applying subtle pressure. Claire was excellent at saying the right words while meaning something entirely different. Over the following days, the texts became more frequent and more revealing. I've been thinking about how proud Mom would be to see you so successful and happy. She always wanted the best for both of us. Dad mentioned that you've been helping with his business troubles. You're so generous with family. That means everything. I know I haven't always been the best sister, but I want to change that. Maybe we could all have dinner sometime. You, me, David, and Dad. The progression was fascinating in its transparency. Claire was rewriting our family history in real time, transforming years of neglect and dismissal into a narrative of loving sisterhood temporarily derailed by grief. But the most revealing message came a week later. I've been doing some reading about next tech solutions. David's built something incredible. You must be so proud. I'd love to hear about his work sometime. I've always been interested in technology, but never had anyone to explain it to me. There was the lie that revealed everything. Claire had never shown the slightest interest in technology. She'd spent years making jokes about my computer stuff and rolling her eyes when I tried to explain what I did for work. But now, suddenly, she was eager to learn about David's business. "She's not even trying to be subtle," I told David that evening. "Does that surprise you?" "Not really. Claire has always assumed that charm and persistence can overcome any obstacle. She's probably convinced that if she's sweet enough for long enough, I'll forget about the funeral and welcome her into our lives. And will you?" I thought about it seriously. Part of me missed the sister I'd hoped Claire could be, the family connection I'd always wanted but never had. But I was finally understanding the difference between the relationships I wanted and the relationships that were actually possible. "I'll probably have to have some kind of relationship with her," I said, "but it won't be the one she's imagining. And it definitely won't include access to you or your resources." The final message in the series arrived 2 weeks later, revealing the full extent of Claire's desperation. "Maxine, I know you're busy with your new life, but I'm really struggling financially. The house expenses are overwhelming and I don't know what to do. I hate to ask, but could you help me figure out a budget? Maybe David has some advice about managing money. I just need guidance from people who understand finances." It was a masterpiece of manipulation, positioning herself as helpless while subtly requesting access to David's financial expertise. She was asking for guidance while clearly hoping for direct assistance, but reading it, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete clarity about who Claire actually was and what she actually wanted from me. The desperate text had stripped away all pretense, revealing a person who had never valued our relationship except as a means to get what she needed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let family guilt override my better judgment. The lawyer's letter was formal and unambiguous, typed on letterhead that commanded respect and attention. David had suggested consulting with an attorney after Claire's increasingly aggressive attempts at contact, and I was grateful for his practical approach to what had become an emotionally exhausting situation. "Miss Claire Richardson," the letter began. "We represent Ms. Maxine Richardson Chen in matters related to family communications and estate settlement. Please direct all future communications regarding these matters through our office." It felt strange to see my name with Chan attached, but also empowering. I wasn't just Maxine Richardson anymore, the overlooked daughter trying to navigate family dysfunction alone. I was part of a partnership that provided both emotional support and practical resources. The letter continued with precise language about boundaries, no unannounced visits, no contact through third parties, no attempts to reach David directly. All communication about Mom's estate would go through legal channels, removing the emotional manipulation that had characterized every previous family discussion. "Are you sure about this?" David asked as I reviewed the final draft. "Once you send this, there's no pretending things can go back to how they were." "Things can't go back," I said. "And I don't want them to. I've spent 34 years accepting treatment that I wouldn't tolerate from a stranger. Why should family be held to a lower standard than everyone else?" It was a revelation that had been building since Mom's death. Watching Claire's behavior at the funeral, reading her manipulative text, and processing my childhood experiences had helped me see that family relationships needed the same boundaries as any other relationships. David had been careful not to influence my decision about Claire, but his perspective had been invaluable. Having grown up with wealth, he'd experienced his share of people who were interested in his resources rather than his person. The hardest lesson I learned, he told me, was that sometimes people who claim to love you are actually just invested in what you can do for them. It doesn't make them evil, but it does make the relationship transactional rather than genuine. That description fit my relationship with Claire perfectly. She'd never been interested in who I was as a person only, in what I could provide when she needed it. The legal boundary setting wasn't just about Claire, though. It was about establishing a new pattern for how I allowed myself to be treated. For too long, I'd accepted emotional manipulation because it came wrapped in family obligation. Dad called 3 days after we sent the letter. "Maxine, honey, don't. You think this lawyer business is a bit extreme? Claire's been crying for days about how you won't talk to her. Dad, did you hear what she said to me at Mom's funeral? She was grieving. She was cruel," I interrupted, surprising myself with my firmness. And her behavior since then has been about accessing David's wealth, not about repairing our relationship. She's curious about your husband, naturally. Dad, Claire has never been interested in my life until she discovered I married someone wealthy. If that doesn't concern you, it should. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Dad had spent decades managing Claire's emotional volatility by giving her what she wanted and expecting everyone else to accommodate her behavior. Challenging. That pattern meant challenging him to see the family dynamics differently. Your mother wanted you girls to have a relationship, he said finally. Mom wanted us to have a healthy relationship, I corrected. She apologized to me before she died for not protecting me from Claire's behavior. She wouldn't want me to accept mistreatment in the name of family unity. After I hung up, I felt the strange combination of relief and sadness that comes with necessary but painful decisions. I was grieving the family relationships I'd always hoped for while protecting the life I'd actually built. David found me that evening in my home office, responding to work emails with unusual focus. Productive day? He asked. I needed to do something normal, I said. Something where my value is recognized and my contributions matter. Your contributions matter here too, he said gently. I know, but work feels clean right now. No hidden agendas, no emotional manipulation, just problems that can be solved with logic and skill. He understood. Professional success had always been my refuge from family dysfunction, the place where I felt competent and valued. Now it was also a reminder that healthy relationships were possible with colleagues who respected my expertise, with David who valued my partnership, with people who saw my worth clearly. The boundary-setting process taught me something important. I had more power in family relationships than I'd ever realized. For years, I felt like a victim of circumstances beyond my control, but choosing to protect myself, to demand respectful treatment, to walk away from toxicity, those were choices I could make regardless of how other people responded. Claire might never understand why I'd set these boundaries. Dad might continue to enable her behavior, but those were their choices to make, not problems for me to solve. For the first time in my adult life, I was prioritizing my own well-being over family peace. It felt revolutionary. The house keys were warm in my palm as David and I stood in front of our new home, a craftsman-style house in a quiet neighborhood, 40 minutes from my family's drama and a lifetime away from the emotional patterns that had defined my first 34 years. No more hiding, David said as we walked through the front door for the first time. As homeowners, he was right. This house represented something I never had before, a space that was entirely ours, free from family expectations and toxic dynamics. We'd chosen it together, designed the renovations together, and planned to fill it with people who genuinely cared about us. The decision to move had crystallized during a dinner party at David's old place. We'd invited my work colleagues, some of his business associates, and a few couples we'd met through mutual friends. Watching these people interact, asking genuine questions about each other's lives, celebrating successes without jealousy, offering support during challenges, I realized what healthy relationships actually looked like. I want more of this, I told David after everyone left. I want to build a chosen family with people who actually like each other. Then let's do that, he'd said simply. The house hunting process had been revelatory. Instead of considering proximity to family or maintaining old patterns, we focused on what would make us happy. A kitchen where we could cook together, a home office where I could work comfortably, a guest room for friends who deserved our hospitality, a garden where David could pursue his interest in sustainable landscaping. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm being selfish, I admitted as we explored the empty rooms, imagining how we'd make them ours. For wanting to be happy, David asked. For choosing relationships that add value to your life instead of draining it? That's not selfish, Maxine. That's healthy. One of the most meaningful aspects of creating our new life was David's invitation for me to get involved with his foundation's work. Next Tech Solutions donated significant resources to educational programs, and David had been looking for someone to help develop their scholarship initiatives. I know this might feel like mixing business with personal life, he'd said carefully. But your background in technology and your understanding of educational barriers could be incredibly valuable. Working on the scholarship program felt like coming full circle. I was identifying brilliant students who'd been overlooked by traditional systems, kids whose achievements were dismissed or undervalued, young people who needed someone to recognize their potential. "This girl reminds me of you," David said one afternoon as we reviewed applications. He was pointing to an essay from a 16-year-old who taught herself programming while working part-time to help support her family. "She's already surpassed anything I was doing at her age," I said, impressed by her technical portfolio and her articulate writing about using technology to solve community problems. "But look at this line," David continued, pointing to a sentence in her essay. "I've learned to downplay my achievements because success sometimes makes people uncomfortable. But I'm hoping this scholarship will help me find a place where intelligence is valued rather than resented." The words hit me like a physical blow. This teenager had learned the same self-protective mechanisms I developed, the same habit of minimizing herself to make others comfortable. "We're funding her education," I said immediately. "We're funding all of them," David agreed. "But yes, she's definitely getting support." Creating scholarship criteria felt like rewriting the script of my own childhood. We prioritized students who'd overcome family indifference, who'd achieved success despite lack of support, who'd demonstrated resilience in the face of being undervalued. "You realize what we're doing, don't you?" David asked one evening as we worked on program guidelines. "Creating opportunities for overlooked kids. Creating the support system you wish you'd had," he said gently. He was right. Every criterion. We established, every resource we provided, every mentorship opportunity we created was designed to give other people what I'd never received: recognition, validation, and practical support for their potential. The work was healing in ways I hadn't expected. Reading applications from students who'd persevered despite family dysfunction, who'd achieved academic success while feeling invisible at home, who developed their talents in isolation, it helped me see my own journey with compassion instead of shame. I used to think there was something wrong with me. I told David one night as we planned our housewarming party, the first party I'd ever thrown where I was excited about the guest list. "What do you think now?" I think I was a kid doing her best in a difficult situation, and I think I turned out pretty well despite everything. It was a radical shift in perspective, replacing self-criticism with self-recognition. I was successful, kind, intelligent, and capable of deep relationships when given the chance. The problems in my family weren't caused by my inadequacies. They were caused by a system that didn't know how to value what I offered. Standing in our new home, surrounded by boxes that contained the beginnings of our chosen life together, I felt something I never experienced before. Complete confidence that I deserved happiness. The girl who'd felt cut off at the edge of family photos was finally stepping into the center of her own story. The thank you card arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after we'd awarded our first round of scholarships. Written in careful handwriting on simple cardstock, it was from Maya, the 16-year-old programmer whose essay had reminded David so much of my own journey. "Dear Mrs. Chen," it read, "I wanted you to know that your scholarship has changed everything for me. For the first time in my life, I'm surrounded by people who think my ideas are valuable instead of weird. I'm learning that being smart isn't something to apologize for. Thank you for seeing potential in students like me." I read the card 3 times before showing it to David over breakfast. "This is what it feels like," I said, surprising myself with the emotion in my voice. What feels like? Making a difference? Having impact that matters. I paused, searching for the right words. My whole life, I've achieved things that looked impressive on paper, but felt empty because the people who mattered most didn't care. This is the first time success feels meaningful. David smiled, the expression that had first drawn me to him in that coffee shop over a year ago. "You've always made a difference, Maxine. The algorithms you've written, the problems you've solved, the teams you've led, all of that mattered. You just needed people around you who could recognize the value." He was right, but Maya's letter represented something more than professional validation. It was evidence that my experiences, even the painful ones, could be transformed into something that helped others. The scholarship program had grown beyond our initial plans. What started as funding for individual students had evolved into a comprehensive support system that included mentorship, internship opportunities, and a community of achievers who understood what it meant to be overlooked. I want to do more, I told David that evening as we reviewed applications for the next funding cycle. More scholarships? More everything. I want to create programs for kids who are dismissed by their families, support systems for students whose achievements aren't celebrated at home, mentorship for young people who've been told they're too smart for their own good. The foundation work had become my passion in ways I hadn't expected. Every student we supported, every success story we witnessed, every breakthrough moment we facilitated felt like healing something in my own past. 6 months later, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The local university wanted me to speak at their graduation ceremony about overcoming family obstacles to achieve success. The irony wasn't lost on me. The girl who'd been told she'd die alone was being asked to inspire others about building meaningful lives. What will you tell them? David asked as I worked on my speech. The truth, I said. That family rejection doesn't determine your worth. That success achieved in spite of unsupportive people is still success. That it's possible to build chosen families that celebrate your potential instead of resenting it. Writing this speech forced me to articulate lessons that had taken years to learn. The most important realization was that my family's treatment of me had never been about my inadequacies. It had been about their inability to understand or value what I offered. Some of you, I plan to tell the graduates, may go home to families who don't understand your achievements, who minimize your potential, or who make you feel guilty for succeeding. That's painful, but it's not permanent. Your worth isn't determined by other people's capacity to see it. The night before the speech, Dad called. We'd had minimal contact since I'd set boundaries about Claire, but he'd heard about the graduation invitation through mutual acquaintances. Your mother would be so proud, he said, and I heard genuine emotion in his voice. I think she would, I agreed. I've been thinking about a lot of things since the funeral, he continued. About how I treated your success, about the assumptions I made about what mattered. I was wrong, Maxine. About more things than I can probably even recognize. It was the closest thing to a complete apology I'd ever received from him, and it meant more than I'd expected. I'm proud of you, he said simply. Not just for the speech or the foundation work, but for becoming the kind of person who turns pain into purpose. After we hung up, I sat with David on our back porch, watching the garden we planted together flourish in the late spring sunshine. Any regrets? He asked, echoing the question from our wedding day. About Claire? About the boundaries? About leaving the family drama behind? About any of it? I considered his question seriously. A year ago, I'd been living a half-life successful on the surface, but emotionally stunted by family patterns that had convinced me I was fundamentally unlovable. Now I was married to someone who saw my value clearly, doing work that felt meaningful, surrounded by people who celebrated rather than resented my achievements. None, I said, meaning it completely. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The woman who'd once felt destined to die alone had discovered something better than being tolerated by people who didn't understand her. I'd found my chosen family, my true purpose, and my authentic self. Claire had been wrong about everything. I wasn't dying alone. I was finally fully alive.